life, living and making a living can sometimes wear you out, grind you down, and dull your senses. So, for a keen mind and a sharp contributive edge that will give you a better chance of success and happiness, take this time out to sharpen your axe. Stay with us right now for Life Talk.
Welcome to Life Talk. I'm Gina Fitt, and you're invited to participate in another of our ongoing series of verbal essays brought to you in this television format. Vern, last week we had the most wonderful discussion. We were talking about one of my favorite subjects, because I'm in the field of selling, as are many of our listeners, and that was prospecting. And we talked a little bit about the difference between being results-oriented and being process-oriented. And I was hoping we could continue that discussion this week.
Yeah, you can't leave it alone, can you? I mean, once you start talking,
yes.
You know, here we use the word prospector. What does that remind you of?
Oh, a gold miner, of course.
Yeah. Years and years ago, certainly in this part of the country, they had a thing called a grub stake. In other words, these old codgers would come along with their mule or donkey, whatever, and would negotiate a deal for a grub stake. And what that was is that the local merchant would supply them with food and utensils and tools and what have you, and knowing that they were going to go out and prospect, and the idea was they would bring the ore back to them to essay and to participate in. That was part of the deal. And so whenever we think about prospecting, we have to think about the function of the prospector. Usually a grizzled old guy with a white beard and long white hair. But anyway, he would take off, and of course they have the saddlebags, knapsacks, and what have you, and they would pick up ore and check it out and would find strains of gold and would put that in the bags, okay, and they would accumulate and more and more and more. They would get a point of return, you know, where they had to come back because otherwise they'd run out of food and what have you and supplies. And so on the way back, certainly they continued prospecting. But now what would occur oftentimes is they'd pick up some ore and they would be gold, all right, in the nugget, but they would throw it away. Now, why would they throw away gold? That's what they were after. Well, because their bags were full. And this particular ore was not as good as the least that he had in the bag. So why would he keep it? Okay. On the other hand, occasionally he'd pick up a rock or nugget, and it would be obviously better than the least that was in the bag, and so he would replace it and throw away some gold. That make sense?
Yes.
Sure.
Absolutely.
And so by the time he got all the way back, he would have the best possible selection of ore that was possible. Now, you know, in all probability, that most salespeople never reach that point. See, what happens in prospecting for salespeople is they prospect just enough to get a few leads, and then they work them to death. You know what I mean? And become either overjoyed or disappointed about the results again. Okay? And then they got to start all over again. And by the way, prospecting requires a lot of initiative, so once you break that pattern, it's hard to get back. And oftentimes, those salespeople will end up in some other business because of that intermittent application of the process. Where on the other hand, no matter how many leads they had, no matter how good the leads were, if they kept prospecting every day, it wouldn't be long until they're in the same boat as the prospector that we just referred to. For example, let's say, for example, you have a lead box here, okay? And you've got, we'll use the word number 50. You've got 50 leads in here. Okay, and out of those 50 leads, we'll say that you've got, 10 A's, maybe 40 B's, and I want to say 30 B's, and 10 C's. I don't know why you'd keep a D. That's a poor lead, all right?
Okay.
So these are fair, these are good, these are great leads, all right? Now, at this point, most people would stop prospecting, okay? However, can you imagine if you begin to make calls, whether it be on the phone or in person, with this already in the bag, how powerful you could be, how selective, how discerning, how critical of each contact you'd be? Oh, yeah. In other words, there's a power in there that just way beyond the norm. And so you're prospecting along, and say in a whole prospecting period, you pick up one B lead. What are you going to do? Now you throw one of these away, you got 9 C's, but now you got 31 B's. Next day you go out and you pick up a B and an A. All right, you've got 11 A's. All right, you get rid of 2 C's. Okay, now you're down to, what is it? Probably down to 7 C's, and you've got 2 up here, so you've got 32 B's.
Right.
You keep going, pretty soon you don't have any C's. And now when you're prospecting, how much power do you have?
Right.
I mean, you're listening for the truth, you know, the need, the communication, the adoption process to occur, and there comes a time when you could have a whole box of A's. Talk about being independent, being, you know, self-sufficient, feeling as though everything was working. I have worked with salespeople who were that way. There was a fellow named Charles Goff some years ago when we were selling pre-arrangement. I had done that for a couple of years as part of my research. It was the most satisfying, edifying experience I've ever had. And I think we talked about it back when we talked about bottlenecks of bereavement. Charles was a prospector. That was every single day, regardless of circumstances, he did his prospecting. Now, frankly, we had a whole staff that was on the same tack. But Charles, for some reason, stood out because of one thing. He kept precise records, and he was very, very effective, and had become that way because of the consistency. And he was to a point, let's see, we'll say arbitrarily that we're in February, and we're prospecting. And we've got all these leads, and he would say, well, I hope you understand, Mrs. Johnson, that I'm not going to be able to get to you now. This is after he's got a commitment to come, okay? I'm not going to be able to fulfill the appointment probably until the latter part of April. I hope that'll be okay. Well, how easy is it to make an appointment in April as opposed to February when it's February? It's easy. You know what I mean? It's easier. And plus, that certainly conveys the idea that you're busy, you're effective, you're a professional. Some of these people, Gina, were calling in and saying, is there some way we can speed this up?
Really?
They became aware of their need for the product, and they were accelerating it. It's really fascinating. But he was booked that far ahead. Can you imagine feeling secure?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And that is not a normal process, but it can come only from a continued process in the prospecting. Now, the prospecting, it doesn't really matter how you do it, whether it's door-to-door, store-to-store, office-to-office, on the phone, through radiation. If you have a concept of contacting a minimum number of people per day, or better still, working for a minimum amount of time. For example, Charles Goff, that I have just made reference to, was prospecting 1 hour a day, and frankly, it was between 5 and 6 p.m.
Oh, really?
That was his prospecting hour every single day. Now, by the way, when I say from 5 to 6, I don't mean 5:02 to 5, until 10 minutes to the hour. He was right on, exactly started on time, ended on time, 5 days a week, and then he would prospect between 12 and 1, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays for 8 hours of prospecting. Now, those are hours you'd think normally weren't the best. He found they were the best for him. Why? Because they were available to him. They did not interfere with his selling time or his family activities. But he got in 8 hours a week, and out of that was able to build quite a business for himself. So it was fascinating.
Well, Bern, how do you get started?
Started in the prospecting process? Take a deep breath, you know, and pick a time to start, a place to be, and yourself in the formula, okay? In other words, you be there then, okay? In other words, the being is yourself in that certain place there at a certain time. It's really fascinating. If you say, well, I'm going to prospect tomorrow, you may not. It's so easy to avoid doing.
Before but if you know it, it's 9 p.m., and of course you can't call anyone after 9 o'clock.
Exactly, you could, but you're probably not going to. Right. Yeah, I think, I know that if you have to have this trinity of esteem, okay, is this point right in here where you satisfy your libido by being in the moment and being at a certain place at a certain time at that, you know, right there, be there then. It's kind of like if you say at exactly 9 o'clock, I'm going to dial this phone number, all right? And you do it at exactly 9 o'clock, check how you feel. There's a sense of, aha.
I did it.
Because who could ask any more?
Right.
no one could ask anything more than doing what you say you're going to do, when you said you was going to do it, in the best possible way. You frankly don't have to be very good. I mean, I have personally had such inept, inadequate applications to this that created great results. I think people want to be good before they do anything, and that's a big mistake. But if you're there and you get started, and by the way, when you start, that's all you're thinking about is a moment to start, and then based on the esteem and the authority that you get from that starting, say, okay, say it's 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, here I come. Just compartmentalize into a short period of time and then flow to it. You don't have to hurry, don't have to dawdle, but just flow to and be there and have a sort of a script where you're asking people, you telling them what you're up to and what it's about, and soliciting their interest. And if it's not there, to say, I understand, and go on to the next one and keep a record as you're doing it. I think in a few weeks we're going to be talking about a thing I call the Initiative Journal.
Okay.
It's a powerful, powerful work tool, and I don't think we've gotten into it on the show yet.
No.
But it's a form that I developed over the years that kind of reduces anxiety and recaptures initiative. And I have never known a salesperson who used it who did not excel. Never, not
Really?
one time. Powerful, powerful tool. There's no question. The thing of it is, the prospecting process is what it's really all about. And if a person can claim the fame of the prospector, he'll be a great salesperson. I've never known a mediocre salesperson who was a good prospector. But I've never known a good prospector who wasn't a great salesperson.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so that seems to be the real key, because prospects buy. It doesn't take nearly as much closing power and what have you, although we're going to head in that direction certainly in the not-too-distant future. Prospecting can be fun if you are process-oriented, if you're screening out non-prospects instead of soliciting for a sale, and if you're pretty scripted in what you're up to. You know, I think it's important to introduce yourself and your company and what you're up to and solicit people's time. One thing, by the way, I can throw in that's not done very often. You know, when you're prospecting and making appointments, there's sort of a language of that that's used with people or on people, I think, too many times, where you say, now, Mrs. Johnson, I'm going to be in your neighborhood on Tuesday or Thursday. Which would be better for you? I know you've heard that.
Oh, yes.
There's a little alternative choice there. And would early in the evening be best or late in the evening? You know, you give these little choices and they're supposed to pick. What you're really doing in that process sometimes is that you're putting that potential prospect into a position where they either have to be rude or accommodating. They don't want to be rude, so they accommodate the salesperson. They will allow you, by making that choice that you offer them, to make an appointment on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. But you made the appointment, they didn't. And so you go there sometimes Tuesday at 7 o'clock and they're not there. And you feel stood up, where in truth I don't think you are necessarily. It's just that they weren't conscious of the appointment. They were accommodators. They accommodated you, and so if something else comes along, they will accommodate that, or them. Like, for example, you have an appointment with someone at 7 p.m. on Thursday, and we'll say at about 5:30, old George calls them and say, hey, the gang's going out for pizza. I'd like to have you come along because you're the life of the party. And say, well, no, I kind of have something I got to take care of this evening at 7. Say, hey, do it some other time. We really want you there for pizza. They don't know how to say no. And so they kind of wander off to pizza, and you're there, and they think they stood you up, and they didn't. They didn't even consider you. Follow what I'm saying? Or in some cases, frankly, they get anxious about the visit. They think that you're going to be the typical role model, if you would, the person who tries to sell them something they don't want, don't need, and can't afford.
Right.
And so they get anxious, and so they find a way to get away. Now, the alternative to that I've had excellent luck with is not making appointments.
Really?
Yeah, but asking permission to drop by.
So how would you do that if I were your prospect?
Well, if I'm talking to you and we agree that we're going to get together. Okay, that's the first thing. We have to agree that...
How do you get me to agree?
Oh, only if you're interested in what I'm talking about. Because it's okay for you not to be. You know what I mean? Like, I'm telling you what I'm up to, and if there's some interest there, now I may offer you a premium for your time and courtesy, or I may certainly make it worth your while in some way, or stimulate enough interest where you want to see me. And then I would say, now, Gina, when you're doing this kind of work, you're really at other people's disposal, okay? In other words, and so when is it impossible to find you? I mean, when is it impossible to get together? For example, like Wednesday night, do you have church, and Friday night basketball or something? And I'll give them a clue, even give them some outs. And I'll say, but when can't I catch you? Well, they start talking, and they can't create a whole week. All right? In other words, they'll say, well, Wednesday night is busy, and Friday, and I'm never here Saturday morning. And if you listen, you'll hear the gaps. And so I'll say, well, it sounds like then that Monday, Tuesday, or Friday might be appropriate. And they say, well, yeah. And I'll say, well, how early in the evening can I come without interfering with the dinner and dishes? And they'll give me an early time. And how late can I come without interfering with bedtime? And so I'll get a permission on Tuesday, Wednesday, or we'll say Thursday from 6 until 10 p.m. A permission to drop by, and if it's inappropriate, just chase me away, and I'll catch you some other day. Okay? And so I got permission to drop by. I drop by, and since most of us are accommodators, I mean,
yes,
most of us are by nature accommodators, and say, well, there I'm standing, and they did say I could drop by, and so there's a moment of adjustment, and usually they say, well, okay, well, come on in. You know, whether it's in the business office or in a home, it doesn't seem to make any difference. Now, on the other hand, if indeed I caught them at a bad time, I previously gave them permission to chase me away, and I would come another day. So if I caught them at an inappropriate time, I don't feel bad, because that was a part of our agreement. And what I will find, though, is that they'll make an appointment. Like if they can't receive me on my drop-by, my experience has been they'll say, well, gee, I'm sorry, I can't, we don't have time this evening. Can you come by Thursday? And I'd say, well, I will certainly try. How early, how late? Okay, now they made the appointment. Follow what I'm saying? And my experience is they'll honor those. They will honor those, typically. It's a whole different perspective. It works in insurance. It works in, I mean, anything that's sold direct to the home, certainly.
That's really
and it does work with business people. It's kind of fascinating. We do have to be aware of a couple of things, though, in the process.
Okay.
Things we have to be aware of and either adopt or deny. In 1959, I was in overwhelm. I was in a business that required 70 presentations a day.
How could you do 70 presentations?
Hustle.
Oh, I guess.
Yeah, there's 2 every 15 minutes.
Oh, my goodness.
It was an experiment with the Fuller Brush Company years and years ago, and the average Fuller Brush man was doing 55 calls a day. And I figured, well, that's average. That's the best of the worst and the least of the best. And I figured the only way to beat that was to do more calls. And so I committed myself to 70 presentations a day. And there's a whole, I'll talk about that in the future, about how I was able to eventually do that with comfort. But one of the things that I developed in those years was this big magical E, the magnificent E, I call it. It's this giant E. And I mean, this is a special E. That thing was probably maybe 20, 30 feet tall, maybe 7 to 10 feet thick. It was suede covered, diamond studded.
Oh, you're kidding.
A light emanated from it. It was in my mind's eye, but I had it there as an icon to lead me, to do that next call, to continue, okay? They had this magnificent E. And what I meant for that to signify, first of all, was efficiency, which at the time, and even today, I define as the appropriate utilization of your time and energy toward the fulfillment of a task, okay? Efficiency. Starting on time, being aware, reducing extraneous effort, quitting on time. That was being efficient. Because being efficient is process. You're there, all right? And when you're there, when you said you would be, should be, could be, an interesting thing happens. A natural, genuine enthusiasm develops from that, okay? Because you're without guilt. See, when guilt reduces, enthusiasm begins to generate. It's incredible. And this gives you more stamina, more energy, more creativity. Oh, it's just incredible. Enthusiasm, you know, the original Greeks saw enthusiasm as divine madness. That was what their name meant.
Oh, really?
The divine madness. In that if you've been around enthusiastic people, you know, a new Amway person or a new, what are some of these other ones, prepaid legal person, someone just getting into multi-level or just in a new selling business or a new Christian, you know, the same thing. They're just feverish about it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They're kind of strange. A little mad in that they talk faster and their eyes shine brighter and they talk a little fast. They talk fast, move fast. That's madness. And yet the Greeks also recognized those are the people who got things done. There was a divinity in that. They say ignorance on fire is magical. I mean, all kinds of good things come out, and that's what enthusiasm is. Now, there's an initial enthusiasm, which is very powerful, and then there's an informed enthusiasm where you really know what you're doing, but then there's an earned enthusiasm that comes from efficiency, which is incredibly powerful, that leads you automatically to effectiveness. And those an efficient person will always become effective. Effective people, capable oftentimes, who are inefficient may not be successful. And so if we're going to be concerned about one thing, it's being there then, okay, and staying there as long as you should. The enthusiasm and the effectiveness comes, and everything gets easy because of the excellence that comes from valid expectation. You see, we all have expectations, okay, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. We have them. And if that expectation is an appropriate result because we've been efficient and on process, it's incredible. I have seen more volume coming out of this process than you can possibly imagine. What we have to look out for in this same premise is the big W. The big
Which
ugly,
is?
Yeah, the big ugly W. The big ugly W is for worry and for wishing
Oh, we all do that one.
and for wondering and for wandering and occasionally working. Okay? Now, a lot of salespeople spend a lot of time worrying. Where's the money coming from? When's my next check? I mean, I don't know how I'm going to make it. Wishing that things would be easier or different, wishing there were more leads, wishing people were more gracious, wondering where they're going to go to work to find a prospect, wandering around the city looking for the right place to work. This is the freezing person, wandering around, the star salesman. And then occasionally stopping to work, which I just don't think we should do very much of.
Stopping to work or working?
Yeah, working.
Really?
Yeah, I mean,
Why do you
working
say
is
that?
something we do that we have to do to make a living. In selling, you should be functioning.
And what's the difference, Bern?
It's just an attitude. If you're functioning with the emphasis on the first three letters, having fun.
How come I knew you were going to do that?
When selling ceases to be fun, selling will cease. It's got to be a good time for the seller and the prospect. And if you're not having any fun, boy, I don't care how much we pay a person, if they're not having fun, the job is not going to get done. I mean,
That's
typically.
probably true.
Yeah. And so all of this coming together kind of makes it a fun process. We've been talking about this now for some time. Just a very quick review. Okay, we started way back talking about role identification, the fact that selling really is a job and a business and a profession, all three. Typically, I made a mistake for years, like I said, of calling it a profession because it demands excellence and ethics, okay, and that's a good mark of a professional. But the thing is, unless it's treated like a job, okay, unless we have some disciplines that we punch in and punch out, and unless we treat it like a business, honoring our capital, which is time, keeping a record and accounting of what we do and how we do it, and developing the expertise, okay, that we'll never be as successful as we otherwise might be in the selling process. We also talked in terms of association and relationship to selling, whether we're avocationist. I don't think you're here to hear some of this, but the avocationist is people who get into selling to hide out. They have no intention of working. You know what I mean? In other words, they just go to hide out. The vocationist treats it too much like a job. He won't work evenings. He doesn't want to be bothered on weekends. I don't think a salesperson is going to be that way. They have to follow the pattern of a doctor or a lawyer or CPA during season. I mean, you get up in the morning and you go to sleep thinking about it, and it goes there. Then we talked about the circle graph. And I know you've heard about the circle graph where 30% of all the sales that are made are just because we're there.
Yes.
Okay, and that comes in the prospecting process. You're there, and you run right smack into it sometimes, and it's just delightful. That 55% of the sales are going to come from an adoptive process. Now, to be truly effective with that, you're going to have to stay with us into the future weeks. and review the old shows, perhaps, where we talked about the power of love on a sales call,
Right.
and how to stay in a love mode, and how to be contributive and responsive to the world and the people in it. And so all this begins to tie together after a while. But in the sales process, we talked about dysfunctional accommodators, people who aren't functional and they'll just kind of let people get away with anything. And the progress all the way up to the functional persuader, who's accepted his authority as a salesperson and willing to be dynamic and dramatic and effective, you know what I mean? And for the sake of the prospect always. So it's been an interesting series. And I'm sorry you weren't here for the first 2 or 3 of them, but we'll catch you up.
Great.
And we're going to go on. Is there anything you would like to say about all of this out of your experience, or some of the things you've heard this even today?
I guess one thing I'd like to say is that it's important for our viewers to catch some of the other episodes, because especially if they're in sales or considering going into that field, so much of the other material that we've covered is really relevant.
Totally.
It's not just about a process, but it's also about relationships, and you can't sell without good relationships.
You know, and the people who aren't in selling, who have no intention of being, could benefit from this series on sales because they're consumers.
Absolutely.
See, I would
That's
much
a good
rather,
point.
I'd rather call on a consumer who's aware of what I'm supposed to be doing and is fear-free because they're aware.
Right.
See, the old "let the buyer beware" is unfair. Let the buyer be aware. See, so that we can care and get the job done. There's a big, big difference. So yes, I think the consumer needs to hear this kind of thing. You know, over the years I've done a lot of sales meetings, and I've always attempted to do sales meetings that if in some magical way the people that we were going to call on this week, you know, that we never met before, but if somehow, in some way, they could peek in and eavesdrop on our sales meeting, they would be waiting to receive us.
Yes.
Because they would know what our intention was, to be there to assist, to serve, to edify, to elevate, to enhance, or to enrich their lives. And if we can do that, we'll be fine. We'll be okay. I think it's appropriate to sign off, to say that, oh, and by the way, if people would like to go to a live seminar as our guest, I have some coming up here in the neighborhood soon, they can call 1-800-661-3490, and we'll send them some free tickets. And I want to thank them for watching and remind them that my name is Bern
Moses.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Bern.